right, y'all. Welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I am the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and I've recorded more than 5,000 interviews going back to 2003, all of which are available at scotthorton.org. You can also sign up for the podcast feed. The full archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, introducing Bas Spliet, again, writing for antiwar.com, and this time about the war in Libya, how NATO's war crimes created chaos in Libya. Welcome back to the show, Bas. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Glad to be on.
Great, great. Happy to have you here. And, I'll go ahead and ruin it. In my new book I'm working on, the Libya chapter begins with an apocryphal quote, because I actually don't remember anymore exactly who it was that said this to me, but it was a friend of mine who was a regular person from real life, not a political type from the internet, It said to me, "We had a war in Libya?" And I just thought that was great because I kind of almost can't even blame the guy, because how's he supposed to know? It wasn't a big deal. It was just a 9-month air war, regime change, lynching of a dictator, and plunging of the most important nation in second, I guess, most important nation in North Africa into absolute chaos ever since then. 9 years ago, where chaos has reigned ever since. But to the average American, they might think the wacky Colonel Gaddafi with his mirrored sunglasses and his, Springfield mayor sash is still in charge over there. But turns out not, huh?
Yeah. I think that anecdote is very illustrative to, basically the point I'm trying to make in the article. Because Libya does pop up into the news cycle once in a while. There's not like a whole lot of news about it, but ISIS surfaces in Libya in 2015, or there were suddenly there was this news that 2 years later that there were open slave markets surfacing in Libya.
Oh, there's a news story about that?
No, that was in 2017.
Oh, okay.
But I'm just pointing to the fact that sometimes it pops into the news, and also a lot of weeks it has been in the news quite a bit, because there is like a very complex civil/proxy war going on, and there is some reporting about that, undeniably. But if you go and look at that reporting, they're trying to explain the complex geopolitical situation and how a lot of foreign nations are coalescing around two rival governments and all of that. And sometimes there's a brief overview of Libya, and just maybe they mention just like in one sentence, oh yeah, by the way, NATO waged a war in Libya in 2011, but they never go deeper into this. So I think you can either give this complex overview of what is happening today, or you can choose to go another path, which I think is way more important, to look at what our countries have actually done to wreak havoc in the country and creating the instability and chaos that actually is the cause of what we are seeing today.
Yeah, it really is. Just like with Somalia, it just seems to be unfair that the countries whose governments are responsible for this, that the populations don't even have to be aware at all. I mean, I'm not saying everyone should wear a hair shirt and whip themselves, or, any kind of thing, but we should at least have to know and maybe care a little bit about what our government does to people and how they make things this way. That's what this show's about. That's why you're writing, so that's good. Go ahead and tell us about the brief period there when America let Gaddafi suck up to the United States between 2003 and 2011 there, when they brought him in from the cold finally.
Yes, that's a good point. So Gaddafi was in power for a very long time, like so many autocrats in the Arab world. From 19, there was a revolution in 1969, which overthrew the monarchy, a bit like happened in Egypt, for instance. And basically, Gaddafi was this big villain. He was also accused of terrorist attacks in Europe and all these kind of things. There were U.S. and UN sanctions in the 1980s and 1990s. But in the end, he reluctantly uh, took responsibility for what had happened in Europe with the Lockerbie bombing, and declared that he would get rid of his weapons of mass destruction program in 2003, and then the sanctions were lifted. And for a brief moment there, Gaddafi was friends because this was the war on terror era. So he was part of the extraordinary rendition program of the CIA. So
Yeah.
he tortured terrorist suspects for the CIA and MI6. But then in 2011, with the Arab Spring, some people rose up against his rule, and for some reason, NATO, like a lot of European and Western and US and a lot of Western governments, decided that it was time for regime change. So it was Obama's Iraq moment, if you will, and that of Hillary Clinton, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's important about 2003, I think, that George W. Bush really needed a win because the Iraq War was already going badly. Obviously, they didn't know what they were doing or how to control anything. And for PR's sake, they finally accepted Gaddafi, who'd been begging since at least 96 to try to normalize relations. And then they said, oh, yeah, no, see, he only came into compliance because of the threat that we were going to do to him what we'd done to Saddam. And so we don't have to do all these wars. We only had to do the one big one as a demonstration, and the rest will fall in line. And it wasn't really true. But they needed that for a talking point to demonstrate that, see, the war in Iraq accomplished something. And so this is it. This is what it accomplished, is we cowed that wacky colonel into compliance. When, of course, he was the first guy to put out an international Interpol warrant for bin Laden's arrest in 96, back when the MI6 was using the Al-Qaeda guys from the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group to try to kill him. So now you switch back and forth, America and Britain, whether they support the Islamist terrorists or the secular dictators, and depending which country and which time.
Absolutely. And to point out why it doesn't work and that argument is a fallacy, maybe Gaddafi complied for a while, but I want to mention this anecdote that I also mentioned in the article about back in 2004, just after he agreed to normalize ties completely with the West and the sanctions were being lifted, to point to the fact that he wasn't in support necessarily of the Iraq War. There's this article you can find in the Bulgarian press, and also it's an anecdote one of my professors told me, that he was having a conversation with Tony Blair, the other invader of Iraq, and he balanced his foot on his other knee so that the sole of his foot would point towards Tony Blair. And of course, Tony Blair doesn't have a clue, but that is an extremely very impolite gesture in Arabic culture. That's also why the Iraqi journalist threw his shoe at George W. Bush. So of course, the people in Libya and the people in Iraq don't agree with the idea that George Bush is waging a war in Iraq. We're better now. Quite the contrary, as we talked about it in previous conversations. That enrages people and makes sure they will join opposition groups that will try to fight the occupation, or worse, they will go into terrorist groups, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we know, that the guys that led the revolution in Libya were the Libyan veterans of Iraq War II, where they had been part of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, later known as the Islamic State of Iraq, and then ISIS, and finally the actual caliphate there, same group. And then after Iraq War II, they came home, just like they came home to Syria to cause trouble there. But then here, and I love this part, and I understand it. It's no mystery, but it still is, to me, the height of irony, and it's just so important that right at the time that Obama was killing Osama, which I know people are confused about that, but he was killed in Abbottabad in that raid by the Navy SEAL Team 6 there in May of 2011. And right at that time that Obama's killing Osama, he takes his side in Libya. And then immediately afterwards as well in Syria in 2011, same year. And, you know, it should be unbelievable, but of course there's reasons, international strategery and all of that kind of thing. America's part of the Sunni axis against the Shia, even though we fought Iraq War II for the Shia. They regretted that, so this was part of their kind of trying to correct that somehow by sucking up toward the Saudis, who were a big player in this war as well. But so that's the thing of it, is that somehow by 2011, the idea that keeping groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq down at all costs was over. You know, the war on terrorism was over. Now it's the war for terrorism. These very same groups on entirely different agendas. Oh, look at us. We're humanitarian interventionists. They had to go and save all the people of Benghazi. Boss, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And these so-called revolutionaries, yeah, maybe some people rose up that hated Gaddafi's guts because he was a brutal dictator. There is no denying that. But the people who actually took up arms, they were quite a few of them were like Islamists that are not really democratic revolutionaries, and that is evidenced in the fact that, for instance, there was this huge lie that was reported everywhere that back in February 2011, that Gaddafi was employing foreign Black African mercenaries to crack down on the revolution, on the uprising. But later it was found out by Amnesty investigations and a lot of other people that there is no evidence whatsoever that Gaddafi flew in mercenaries. But you can find articles back in February 2011 in which talking heads of the opposition groups, like political activists and these kind of people, are quoted in media as admitting that, yeah, we executed 50 Black African mercenaries because they were involved in the crackdown. But we now know that there were no African mercenaries. They were just Libyans of darker skin, or there were foreign migrant workers from sub-Saharan Africa. And there's even some evidence, according to Amnesty International, that they lynched Black Africans. So there's your revolution. There's your democratic revolutionaries for you.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think the kernel of truth to that was that there were Tuaregs who were mercenaries who worked for Gaddafi in his own little kind of private Gestapo. He didn't have much of a military because he was afraid to have one, I think. But so he had his own kind of whatever security service he called it. And that did include some of these Tuareg fighters, but they're not really black. So it was, you know, that became the kernel, hardly a kernel of truth to there are foreigners who fight for Gaddafi for pay here. But then they extrapolate that to all blacks somehow are now guilty of being mercenaries, when of course that was absolutely not the case in any way at all. Probably no blacks, very few. The blacks in Libya were migrant laborers, and including the town of Tawerga, where they essentially cleansed the entire town of 10,000 people or something. It was all these black migrant laborers. And David Enders, who was at that time reporting for McClatchy newspapers, I talked to him. He was in Libya at the time, you know, on the phone, talking about how he'd gone to the refugee camps where these jihadists would come in and rape the women every night. the survivors of the Tuareg ethnic cleansing, and then of course, as you're saying, the reports of the lynchings, and this was in the emails from Sidney Blumenthal to Hillary Clinton from the spring of 2011. So still only, like, I think maybe 8 weeks into the war, 10 weeks into the war. And he's saying, hey, Hillary, I'm getting reports that our heroic jihadists here are, rounding up and lynching blacks and calling them mercenaries. That may be the same thing that you're talking about there, or another similar report. And she kept going anyway. Would not negotiate. And we know from the Washington Times series and everything that the CIA and the military were trying to stop the war and negotiate, and the State Department wouldn't let them. And they're leading the charge on the whole thing. And so anyway, that's the thing of it. It's not just the horrible nature of all the ethnic cleansing and everything, but that they knew that, look, these guys that we're backing, they're the Libyan clan. They're not heroes. They don't believe in liberty. They don't believe in democracy. These are Zarqawi's guys. For God's sake.
Yeah, but they wanted their war, and their supporter, like the so-called revolutionaries that they backed, and they themselves committed horrible war crimes upon all kinds of lies. You must know, and probably maybe your audience also know, that Hillary Clinton and even the ICC chief prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo, they claimed that Gaddafi was handing Viagra to his troops to rape, to use rape as a weapon of war. They were actually claiming this while there was no evidence for that whatsoever. Another lie was...
Wait, stick with that one for a minute, because that was hugely important at the time. I mean, this was, saturated the media. That this was, the propaganda. These are barbarians, right? These are like some kind of, savages, not real men fighting a war. They're not professional soldiers in uniforms. They're savage beasts with babies on their bayonets. This kind of propaganda to stir your emotions. When of course it was ridiculous. And I've brought this up a lot of times, sorry, but I love it and I don't want to ever forget it. And I still remember perfectly. Driving west down Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, listening to the AM radio, and some Rush Limbaugh clone, basic Republican talk radio host with no name is saying, look, everybody, even Susan Rice says that Gaddafi is sending his armies out to rape his way across his own country and to rape every woman and girl that they find. And so that's how you know it's true, is if even Susan Rice is saying it. And I'm just laughing and dying, that this is what counts as thinking, is the most ridiculous form of confirmation bias. Like Susan Rice being the one claiming it wouldn't be the number one reason to discount it. It's just like even Bill Clinton says we need to attack Iraq. Well, again, wouldn't that be the number one reason to think that maybe something here is not on the up and up? But anyway, that's just... Yeah, and it meant so much to him, too. He wasn't lying. It was like he was in favor of this war, and to him, to have a liberal Democrat agree was like the ultimate endorsement of a war. That, come on. And in fact, even a female minority liberal Democrat agrees. Like, man, if that isn't the stamp of legitimacy, let me at him. Come on.
Yeah, good point. But it is... we can also really look at how every phase of legitimizing the war had its own lies. So first, in February, there was like this first report surfaced about mercenaries and also the shooting from the sky, that Gaddafi was shooting at his people from the air, These were like, you could find this on every media imaginable. And even Obama also used this later on. And this, if Gaddafi is firing on his own people from the air and is flying in foreign mercenaries, supposedly, maybe a solution is a no-fly zone, they thought. So the UN Security Council voted on imposing a no-fly zone. But then, even though the resolution emphasized that we should look towards making peace, and we want the military mission to be mainly about protecting civilians, supposedly, NATO immediately started bombing, started taking over the mission, and when and exactly so the first strikes were just a few, not that much, but when they started escalating at the end of March, this is when this Viagra story surfaced. And a bit later on, then it was the story that Benghazi was going to be attacked, and then Obama made his big address to the nation around the end of March, I think 28th of March, claiming, and I really want to quote him here: "There will, if we had waited one more day with intervening," he said, "there would be a massacre that would stain the conscience of the world, and that would reverberate across the region." And a couple of days later, or maybe 2 weeks later, he wrote an op-ed together with Sarkozy and Cameron, claiming that if we had not intervened and did our humanitarian crusade, there would have been a bloodbath, and 10,000 of people would have died. But that claim is just ridiculous on the face of it. It's been scrutinized from so many levels, not in the least of which by the British House of Commons itself in 2016. They brought out a report. So the British Parliament themselves said in a report that this was a total lie. There was no evidence whatsoever that Gaddafi was going to inflict genocide on his people, because if you look at previous cities he had retaken in February, there were not a lot of civilian casualties, and there was a disparity, for instance, between the people that were wounded. Only 3%, for instance, were women. So, like, this suggested that the vast majority of people that died were just combatants, which is tragic, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be a genocide against the whole people of Benghazi. So, like, in every phase of the war, they used this new lie. And yeah, as you mentioned earlier, they probably knew that it was a lie, but they wanted their war. They went with it, and now people have forgotten about it. Even though after the war was over, unfortunately not during the war, but end of 2011 and in 2012, there were a lot of reports and investigations coming from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, even the New York Times, pointing out the fact that NATO, they committed war crimes. They killed civilians, even though they claimed they didn't.
Hold on just 1 second. Be right back. So you're constantly buying things from Amazon.com. Well, that makes sense. They bring it right to your house. So what you do, though, is click through from the link in the right-hand margin at scotthorton.org, and I'll get a little bit of a kickback from Amazon's end of the sale. Won't cost you a thing. Nice little way to help support the show. Again, that's right there in the margin at scotthorton.org. Hey, y'all, check it out. The Libertarian Institute, that's me and my friends, have published 3 great books this year. First is No Quarter, The Ravings of William Norman Grigg. He was the best one of us. Now he's gone, but this great collection is a truly fitting legacy for his fight for freedom. I know you'll love it. Then there's Coming to Palestine by the great Sheldon Richman. It's a collection of 40 important essays he's written over the years about the truth behind the Israel-Palestine conflict. You'll learn so much and highly value this definitive libertarian take on the dispossession of the Palestinians and the reality of their brutal occupation. And last but not least is the great Ron Paul, The Scott Horton Show Interviews, 2004 through 2019. Interview transcripts of all of my interviews of the good doctor over the years on all the wars, money, taxes, the police state, and more. So how do you like that? Pretty good, right? Find them all at libertarianinstitute.org/books. You need stickers for your band or your business? Well, Rick and the guys over at thebumpersticker.com have got you covered. Great work, great prices, sticky things with things printed on them. Whatever you need, thebumpersticker.com will get it done right for you. Thebumpersticker.com. Yeah, I went searching through my archives and I couldn't find it. Maybe some listener can help me remember. I used to be good at remembering things. But it wasn't just Juan Cole who was horrible on this, but I could swear that I interviewed someone from Amnesty International. I know I remember this. I couldn't find it, but I interviewed someone from Amnesty at the time, and it started out like, yeah, look, I mean, Gaddafi's no nice guy, right? I mean, everybody knows that. And this guy's like, yeah, no, he's terrible, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, but still, nobody should do anything about it. That'd be crazy, right? Or what are we going to do? And then he was surprised, and I was surprised that he was surprised that he thought he was just there to monger a war, and that's why I had him on. When I just had him on to show that not everybody who's for the war is saying that, oh, Gaddafi's the most wonderful and progressive leader in North Africa, which some people were saying. And I was saying, look, the guy's a piece of garbage. He's a dictator, but still, that doesn't mean you have a war now, you know. But anyway, the Amnesty guy was there to monger a war. And it's funny, I'm not sure why that's not in the archives, but maybe somebody else has it or they know the one I'm talking about, and maybe it is there and I just couldn't find it. But they were horrible on this at the time. In fact, when I was Googling it this morning, I saw where they wrote an article saying, we were not horrible on it. Look at our official statement. And it's like, yeah, but never mind your official statement. Your guy came on my show to monger it. I remember that. So what's up with that? But sorry, I can't prove it because I couldn't find it. But I know that happened. I couldn't have made that shit up.
Scott, I'm very happy that you bring up that point because this is what frustrates me so hard about especially Human Rights Watch and certainly also Amnesty International, that they often come out with good reporting, good investigations of war crimes by our governments, but they tend to come out with that after the war is over or when it's not a big news story anymore. And during the war, they're not unanimously, but they're often warmongering, as you say. That's so true. Like back in 1991, I think Amnesty supported the testimony that Saddam's troops were taking babies out of incubators and throwing them on the floor. They were in support, and especially also in Syria, especially Syria. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty are so complicit in the propaganda, but it is very difficult to scrutinize them with people that are like more mainstream, if you will, because you have to be either against them or for them. But I think these are organizations. They're good. It's good that they're around, but they make so many mistakes, and they should be held accountable for that. And maybe from Libya, a good example is that I quote in the article one incident in which 34 civilians, I think, were killed. NATO just basically bombed the house with a lot of people in. There was no evidence whatsoever that it was a military target, as NATO claimed, but it killed 34 civilians and a lot of children as well. Just horrifying. And in the investigation, which I think was published in 2012, they mentioned that Human Rights Watch, they visited the site 4 times, including one the day after the attack had happened in September 2011, which is still a month before Gaddafi is eventually overthrown, right? So why don't they come out in September 2011 saying we are not exactly sure yet, but we have this mounting evidence that NATO has committed war crimes? No, they wait until the war is over to publish it and make a big deal out of it when everyone has already forgotten about the war. And This is so frustrating.
Yep. All right, now this is just a side note, a small little parentheses here that this war was totally illegal, that the President of the United States has no authority, no legal right whatsoever to start a war without getting a declaration of war from Congress. And the President himself, at least according to Robert Gates, who I think was honest about this, must have been, he said that Obama had said that his decision to start this war was 51-49. Not 90-10 or 70-30 or even 60-40, but 51-49, which is nothing other than an admission of a war crime itself right there. That's an admission right there that he didn't have to do it. It was a choice whether to start a war. and he decided to start a war. But that's illegal. Not just as unauthorized, but it's a war crime. And that makes him a felon. And that doesn't even matter. That's just a technicality. I hate to get bogged down in the technicalities, but Congress, when they did convene on this question, refused to condemn the war and defund it, but they also refused to ratify it. And it went on for another 5 months after that, which is unprecedented. You know, even when Truman invaded Korea without permission, Congress quickly ratified it with their rubber stamp for what it was worth. But here they didn't even get that. But anyway, who cares? That doesn't matter. That's just the letter of the law. No big deal. Nobody cares about that anyway. But just pointing out that, you know, if there was such a thing as the law, then this wouldn't have happened at all. But now, so, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, ever since 9/11, as far as I understand, you're the American, so you will be the expert. But yeah, there's not really been, even before that, but especially since 9/11, there was this authorization for use of force against Al-Qaeda. And
well, they authorized Iraq separately. They did have a separate authorization for Iraq War II, but not for Somalia.
Yeah, I think, but Iraq War II is the only one, right?
Yep. None for Libya. Now on Syria, that was they didn't really have a war there exactly. That was a covert action which the president legally can do with a finding, can authorize the CIA to fund terrorists. But
still, I hold the point that arguably the war wouldn't have happened to the effect that it did happen without American ideological and covert supports and support of their allies, which inflated the insurgency. And the same is true for Libya. I quote these experts in the article, a Cambridge historian called Dirk van der Wallen, who wrote a book about the history of Libya. He said in his book, at the end of his book, in the updated version, he said, for the rebels, NATO's involvement became a sine qua non for just to be able to maintain their positions, and NATO was absolutely essential in their advancements and in their eventual overthrow of Gaddafi. Mm-hmm. So without NATO, it wouldn't have happened probably, and it wouldn't have descended into chaos, and all of the horrible stuff we see nowadays in Libya would probably not have happened. That doesn't mean that we think that Gaddafi is a good guy, but I think there are very few people that will argue that today Libya is in a better shape, with almost a third of the population having fled the country by now. Absolutely horrible.
Wow, I didn't realize that. Not surprising, though. And, of course, the CIA parachuted General Haftar in there, but quickly decided they didn't like him anymore, and the Russians picked him up. He's been fighting from Benghazi. An interesting turn. The secularists own the east of the country and the Islamists the west, in a reversal from before the war there. And Haftar has just attacked Tripoli over and over again and failed to take it over. And you have the Turks, of course, backing the Islamists, Muslim Brotherhood-type guys in Tripoli, while the Saudis are, and the Egyptians, I guess, are with Russia backing Haftar. And who knows what the Americans are doing? I don't know. I'm sure the Americans are probably on both sides.
Also the UAE should be mentioned, especially backing Haftar, as well as Egypt, indeed. And I saw something to the effect that the Emiratis try to lobby the United States to get more involved, but Trump said something to the effect of, we're already involved in so many places, so we'll skip on this one. I guess that was a good call, but
good
that
enough
doesn't
for me. Yeah.
That doesn't mean that their crimes should go unpunished.
Yeah.
Because maybe another reason I wrote the article now is I'm sure you know, and you interviewed people, and your audience also probably knows that our great ally in Kosovo back in 1999 is now at least charged with war crimes, and maybe it's a good time to rethink what happened in Libya and at least contemplate that if, like in Serbia in 1999, maybe the United States and its European allies in the context of NATO are complicit in war crimes. And I think the evidence, we haven't really talked about it, but I mentioned some examples in which it's pretty clear that they bombed sites of no military significance and killed many civilians. So yeah, why are people not talking about that?
Yep. Mostly because they don't know anything about it. Or, in the case of liberal Democrat types who, favor Obama, they don't want to say anything to besmirch him, especially when they have Trump to compare him to. They just don't want to hear it. And Republicans, they're mad about Benghazi, but smashing Gaddafi, that's something that most Republicans can support, even under Obama, I guess, it turns out. Even though Ronald Reagan didn't do it, Ronald Reagan just bombed him for a day or two, did try to kill him, but then backed off.
Yeah.
But Obama can have, 100 times the war Ronald Reagan had there, and nobody bats an eyelash. Ain't that something? And you know what it is? It's because of Iraq War II. Because George W. Bush just marched the entire 3rd Infantry Division and the entire Marine Corps and all this stuff in there. And it made such a spectacular disaster out of it all that then a drone bombing anywhere, no matter how many women and children are killed, still doesn't compare. And an air war like what happened in Libya, where special operations forces and the militiamen fighting on the ground and American air power up there, planes don't fall, other than the F-35, our planes don't fall out of the sky very often. The soldiers are, our airmen are not threatened. Our Navy pilots are not threatened. And so they can just do that. And it's like the Kosovo War. It's like a cheap and easy and high-tech space age war that doesn't cost our side anything. And so, and there's even, in fact, it's probably the perfect example, is Jeremy Scahill, who's the great progressive journalist, on the Bill Maher show, saying that what Obama's doing with these drones killing people is wrong. And this is this is the war against terrorism. Never even mind the war for it. But this is the, killing people in Yemen, fighting against AQAP, this kind of thing. And Bill Maher, he can't help it, He's not that smart. He just goes with his gut and he goes, yeah, but compared to Iraq, it's so small. And so, that's it. It's a blank check. It's a free pass. If it's less worse than Iraq War II, it's permissible.
Yeah. I recently got around to reading Garrett Porter's book about the Vietnam War. What's it called? Perils
really?
of...
that's great. I have it,
yeah.
And I still haven't read it. I'm jealous of you now.
It's a dense book. It is kind of difficult to read because it's so packed with so much information. But I'm over halfway now. And his basic argument about the Vietnam War, is that the reason that it happened is not communists were going to take over the world. It's because the United States realized that it had no rivals that could stop them. So that's why they did it. And I think that's also why, for instance, in Libya, you mentioned there's no way the American or European airplanes were going to be shot out of the sky. And because they create this dominance, this is the whole argument of the no-fly zone is, for me, is debunked in this way. You create this dominance by the overlord protector, which is NATO, and they back one side in a conflict, and that's why they can change the political situation on the ground, and they can make their advance, and that's why they were able to overthrow Gaddafi, and that's because it was a dictator. Yep. Socialist repressive regime. Instability follows.
Yep. Yeah, the perils of dominance. You think you're such a big shot, you can do anything, but it turns out you can't. That's basically it. And in fact, people remember back in 2002, the spirit of the whole thing was the U.S. Army can do anything. Are you saying it can't, pal? And then that was the whole thing. Well, look, they probably can't bake a really nice cake or, all kinds of different things that are not their speciality, like determine who ought to rule next in Iraq, something like that. Can they defeat Saddam Hussein's army? Sure. But who says that any of the rest of what's going on there is within their purview? But the idea is, but they're so strong. And Bush would talk about that too. Our forces, they're so strong that they can just insist and things will go the way that they want, which of course is just not true and turned out not to be true. But that was the idea, very, so in other words, the sense that you're talking about, only very explicit,
Exactly.
So
and it's a good argument to like what the libertarian theory is, that like if like two parties have a lot of like are well prepared or aren't, and they're more or less as powerful, they will be deterred from shooting at each other. When that equality is gone, violence follows, unfortunately.
Yep.
But maybe I'm guessing you're starting to run out of time, so maybe I just really want to read a quote to remind folks of how terrible the airstrikes could have been. And I have this one very powerful quote from a survivor.
Sure,
that
go ahead.
maybe can shed light on how horrible NATO's war in Libya was back then, and that's not even talking about the consequences. So I guess it was in August. NATO bombed this compound not too far from Tripoli, and it turned out that this was just civilian buildings, and a lot of people died in it. And this is a quote through Amnesty International from one of the survivors. "I can't understand why they bombed my home. We are civilians and had nothing to do with the war, politics, or any such things. I lost my daughter Hanan, who was due to get married after Ramadan, and my nephew's little girl Arwa, who was always laughing and running around, and my brother's daughter Salima, and her 3 little children, and her sister-in-law Mansia, and her little twin girls had come to visit from Benghazi and got stuck here because of the war. They were all killed together with other relatives, and my wife Fatia sustained a serious head injury and her left leg had to be amputated. She's in Germany now for medical care. Maybe the injuries can heal eventually, but the heart can't. My home became a graveyard for my family, and until today, neither NATO nor the NTC, the National Transitional Council, which replaced Gaddafi for a while, have even contacted us, not even to say sorry or to ask us about the victims. We have been forgotten."
Yeah. Imagine a Libyan is just like an American human, only from somewhere else, and feel just the same way that we might feel in their same situation. A bomb falling through the roof of their own house, huh? Blowing their entire extended family away, huh?
It was to prevent genocide, supposedly, and I think Nafis Ahmed, whom I'm sure you're familiar with, has even argued that NATO has also bombed part of like some parts that were vital to the great man-made river project, the water infrastructure. It's a desert country, so water is pretty important. This is not only a war crime, but might amount to genocide, because if you obstruct the water system, which back in 2015 when he wrote the article at any rate, I suppose it's not better now. There are still 4 million people left without water, and the water crisis continues to escalate, he wrote. And yeah, if you look at international law, and if you, just like in Yemen, when the Saudis are doing, they're bombing literally agricultural grounds. So yeah, you could make the argument that Obama wasn't stopping genocide. Maybe he was even complicit in one.
Yeah. Him and Hillary Clinton out there walking the streets right now. That's scary.
He came, we saw, he died.
Yeah, they did. By the tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands by now. By the way, is anyone counting excess death rates in Libya? Do you know?
I have no answer to that. I'm not sure. But it's difficult to count, of course, because you have people dying due to direct consequences of the conflict. But yeah, if you think about Bas Spliet's way of with the seen and the unseen, like the fact that if you're bombing a nation's water supply, what does that do to an already impoverished nation? The lives that you destroy indirectly should be counted, but it's impossible to count.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, I guess I'm all out of questions here. I really need to focus on what America's role is there right now. But we'll have to get back to that. Maybe that can be your next one.
Yeah, United States is less involved right now. So maybe very briefly, you have like the two rival governments, Haftar, which is more the secular one and is supported by the United Arab Emirates, to a little extent the Saudis, Russia, and Egypt. And Egypt, Sisi made some very dangerous statements. Other sides, you have the more Islamist governments backed by Turkey. I should mention France is also involved with Haftar. On the other side, you have Islamist governments together with Qatar and especially Turkey. Because France is our ally, United Arab Emirates is our ally, Turkey is our ally. So I think Trump doesn't really know what to do. Maybe that's for the better.
Yeah. Well, he's got Special Operations Command in virtually every other country on the African continent right now. So if they're skipping Libya for the moment, that'd be all right. All right. Well, listen, thanks very much for your time again. And thanks for writing another great one for antiwar.com. I sure appreciate it, boss.
You're welcome.
All right, you guys, that is Bas Spliet. And this one, well, it'll be running on antiwar.com by the time you hear this, I guess. It's called How NATO's War Crimes Created Chaos in Libya. The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.